Okay. Can you see the slides, the title slides, John? Jason?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see him.
Okay, I'm just going to put it into presenter mode here. There we go. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. Our webinar this month is the business of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And we've had an incredible response to this webinar. We had north of 700 people registered today. So Dr. Saunders, clearly there's interest in this topic and your expertise. So thank you for joining us. A couple things before we get started. First of all, we have our moderators in the chat, and they're going to be bubbling up questions to me that come in through the chat. And I'll try to get Jason to answer as many of those as we can as we go through the presentation here today. So if there's something you want to know that's on your mind about HBOT and we're not covering it on the slides, just bring it in the chat and I'll surface as many as we can throughout the webinar so that we can address as many questions as possible. And then the second thing was, we're really going to focus not so much on like, how does hyperbaric therapy work medically? I think there's tons of information on that out there. What we really want Jason to focus on is the business side of owning and operating one or more chambers in a clinical setting. So I think that's more where we want to get into the unit economics, the brass tacks of like, what does it cost me to lease, own, operate, maintain, insure? So we're going to spend more of our time on that, less so on the actual biology of it all. So we'll try to keep it focused to the business side. We'll start off here in a second with some introductions. Then I'll turn it over to Dr. Saunders for the bulk of the presentation. We've got a demo towards the end of Heads Up and how we can help you track hyperbaric outcomes. One of the more important pieces of keeping people on their program is being able to demonstrate meaningful progress and outcomes. We'll show you how that works. We'll be doing Q&A throughout the whole thing. As usual, we got some sweet prizes and then follow-ups and next steps at the end. So before I introduce the panelists, I guess I'll start off. I'm Dave Korsunski, founder, CEO here at Heads Up. Heads Up is building practice-based outcome software. What does that mean? It means how do we actually effectively measure that protocols are working, that people's health is improving, and that we're doing things correctly. So we're mainly a platform for measuring health outcomes. Dr. Lemansky, quick intro for us, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thanks to everybody joining us and Dr. Saunders for being here. So I'm the Chief Medical Officer. For background, I'm board certified in internal medicine. I worked in the hospital setting as a hospitalist for many years. Found that most of the people I was seeing were suffering from chronic diseases that were just being, managed and not actually corrected. So started a functional medicine wellness practice, joined Heads Up as the chief medical officer after being an investor and user of it. And, really excited to hear what Dr. Saunders has to say about, incorporating HBOT into clinical therapies. So I'll give it over to you to introduce yourself.
Sure. So really glad to be here. Dave, you and I have done a couple other shows in the past where, typically we are focused a little bit more on the biology, physiology, like the science of hyperbaric. For those of you, probably, I don't know, maybe many of you have seen some of my, talks on hyperbaric or my YouTube channel. But historically, I could talk about the science of hyperbaric like ad nauseum. I do it all the time. I do it for a living. I train, I educate, I certify technicians and practitioners in hyperbaric medicine and, lecture all over the world, essentially at other conferences on topics like this, and not just hyperbaric, but essentially, hyperbaric and other functional medicine modalities that might work really well with one another. On Separately, I do quite a bit of consulting work, either for, some of the larger manufacturing companies or for, clinics that are utilizing hyperbaric. And so, um, as much as I love the science, my whole goal in doing any of this is really increasing patient access to incredible tools like hyperbaric. And essentially, and I figured this out relatively early on in my own career. If the business isn't healthy, it really doesn't matter how many tools and toys and services that I offer. I won't be open long enough to serve the community in the way that I want to. And so, helping other people basically function at that level, so that not only can we provide exceptional care, but we can have a healthy business that allows us to thrive as a result of the incredible care and services that we offer. That's a pretty major passion of mine. And so it's a different topic for me to talk about in this format, but I'd love to share the conversations that I have with so many practitioners all over the world, and hopefully help develop some ideas in your mind with regard to the business behind hyperbarics. And essentially, like Dave said, I have some ideas of what comes up often, and that's primarily what I plan to share. But, I'm here essentially for whoever decided to show up for this show. And so please ask questions, because, if you know me at all, you know that I'm a completely open book. I'm completely transparent, and I love to share um, as much as I can to help people get it done and do it right. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I've watched tons of your content online, and as someone who uses HBOT therapy personally and regularly, you put just a ton of great, free, super helpful information out there. So I just want to acknowledge everything that you're contributing to this industry. In the chat, our moderators, we have Erin Knight. She's our Director of Business Development. We have Ryan. He's our Head of Marketing. And we have Chuck, also known as Inspector Gadget, because he tests every wearable known to man and can be seen wearing anywhere from 1 to N wearables at any moment in time. So he can answer all things related to digital health, heads up, across the board. So feel free to blast them with questions in the chat. So as usual, we have some nice prize giveaways here today. Some of the companies that we partner with here at Heads Up, True Diagnostic with their longevity test that can be integrated inside the Heads Up platform. And Dr. Jason's going to talk about, for example, how hyperbaric therapy can improve a lot of the biomarkers of longevity and aging, specifically telomere length. So can we measure that as part of a hyperbaric treatment program? So we've got a True Diagnostic kit to give away. We've got some Quicksilver supplements to give away. They're liposomals. Our two partners on the HBOT side are OxyHelp and OxyHealth. We'll talk a bit about their products as partners of Heads Up. And then Aura, the ring, we love it. Also another great device to use as part of hyperbaric therapy. And can we start to see improvements in heart rate variability, in the quality of physical rest and recovery? And we have some case studies on HBOT with Aura, and we'll talk about those. And Jason, I don't know if there's a thread where exogenous ketones come in with HBOT therapy or ketogenic therapy in general, but Delta G, our preferred ketone sponsor. So if there's anything you want to layer in related to ketones, let us know. The giveaways for the webinar, we're giving away an Aura ring and a 1-year subscription. We're giving a True Diagnostic, True Age test, sample pack of Delta G. These are the ones that I rely on to get my brain dialed in for webinars and other important cognitive things. So we've got a Delta G ketone sample, excuse me, and then a couple liposomal products from Quicksilver. Their glutathione, which I love, and their GABA L-theanine, which I also love. And we'll announce the winners at the end. And the winners will be anyone who was able to stump our panelists or ask an otherwise good question. That is completely arbitrary. Erin Knight is going to come on at the end of the webinar, and she's going to pick the 4 best questions, and we'll give away the prizes in order. So just some fun ways to give away some cool biohacking gear. We like to do this on all our webinars. So before we get started, it'd be great to learn a little bit about our participants. So I'm going to launch the first polling question, which is, We'd like to learn a little bit about your practice. We'd like to learn if you're currently offering hyperbaric therapy in your practice today. And then what else do you offer in there? There's often also a number of other modalities that are available. So we'd like to know which other ones you're using in there, and just roughly approximately how many people do you service in your geographic area. So I'll leave that up here for another minute while we jump into the next slide. Jason, we're going to turn it over to you here for the feature presentation.
Okay.
And I know that these are mainly just cues for you to go through some of the higher level concepts. So we may not speak to everything directly verbatim, but we'll be leaving it to Jason to really touch on the business side of things. And like I said, Jason, I'll keep an eye on the chat here. And maybe after each slide, when you tell me to advance, we can pick one or two questions from the audience just to keep it spicy.
Yeah,
Over
that
to you.
sounds perfect. Great. So I do hope my voice holds up. I literally just got home from recording 6 months worth of YouTube videos and then teaching a 5-day class. So I'm a day out of about 6 days of a lot of talking. So, but
You sound great, brother.
all right, good. So a couple things. So just big overview again. I really did just put a bunch of outline thoughts into these slides because I want to make sure that I'm delivering not so much what I wanted to share with you, but much more so what is hopefully going to be helpful to you. And so I know what we'll be covering, but I look forward to hearing some questions because I want those questions to help steer really wherever you guys happen to be in your business journey, and hopefully really getting some very honest and open answers to some tough questions. So but ultimately we'll touch on the science of hyperbaric just for a minute, just so that in case you're not that familiar, everyone will have just like a very, very basic knowledge of at least what we're talking about. I already saw some questions with regard to like comparing hyperbaric to something like ozone. And so I'm sure we'll cover that kind of stuff later, but essentially they're very different and very unique. We'll talk about a couple different ideas with regard to, is this a good therapy if you're already taking insurance, or is this a cash pay, or, how do we utilize a device like this depending on what type of practice you either already have or the type of practice you're trying to actually move into. The question I definitely get the most is, questions around this hard shell, soft shell. Does one of them only work? Does the other one not work? Does one do soft shells do everything that hard shells can? All the different sort of myths and misconceptions. So I hope to be able to handle a bunch of that. And then we'll move more specifically into the business side of it. What could from a revenue standpoint and a number of sessions, what could you expect from a hard shell, soft shell? Like, what does the business side actually look like? And then we'll go into some training and certification, a little bit of legal, but not a whole lot, just because a lot of that is even state by state, and so license by license. So it might be a little bit too specific for everybody. And then we'll talk about tracking and things like that with the live demo. Go ahead, Dave. You could switch that.
All right. A couple questions, Jason. Let's take one or two here. So let's see. One individual is asking, plastic surgeon looking to purchase a chamber for the office, post-operative wound healing. Any recommendations specifically as it pertains to post-surgery, plastic surgery in terms of HBOT?
We can go a lot of directions there, but the first thing I
Sure.
want to say, which is counter to most people's initial thought, is if you're actually utilizing it for around surgical cases, especially let's say plastic surgery, where these are surgical interventions that are pre-planned ahead of time, pre-treating the tissue as opposed to only thinking about it as post-surgical recovery, I would want you to really consider it as a pre-treatment, actually preparing the tissue for a healing response before the surgery even begins. That's going to have a exponentially larger impact on that person's total healing phase than the post-treatment alone would. In
Makes
fact,
sense.
if I could only either pre-treat or post-treat, I would only pre-treat people. That's how much of a difference I think pre-treatment makes. So I want to plant that seed in your
What would a
mind.
pre-treatment protocol be, Jason?
So it could vary, and we've done it a couple different ways with other docs that may send us patients, as part of their own protocol. Obviously, we don't do surgery ourselves, but I would say on the shortest end, like at least 3 to 6 hours before surgery would make an incredible difference. If I can, I would like to do usually 10 sessions before a surgery, and literally as close together and leading as close up to the surgery as possible.
Okay, so 10 hours of dive time as close as possible leading up to the event is considered optimal. Is that fair?
That would be ideal in most cases, yeah.
Copy that. Okay. All right.
And just as a thought, you could get away with using a soft chamber in that environment, but I would say that most people would want to steer you towards higher pressure for post-surgical healing. And I think in most cases, if that's able to happen, I think you'll get better results if you did it that way.
Awesome. All right, back to you.
All right. So just very, very brief on the science. Essentially, all I really wanted to share is that the fact that right now you and I are just having this conversation, we're all breathing air, and the fact that you can actually get oxygen into your body even right now, just having this conversation, is because our atmosphere has a pressure associated with it. And essentially, it's the pressure that we live at that creates the driving force, so that when we take a breath in, the pressure of oxygen in your air is higher than the pressure of oxygen in your lungs. The pressure of oxygen in your lungs there is then higher than the pressure of oxygen in your circulation. The pressure of oxygen in your circulation is then higher than the pressure of oxygen at any working cell where it's going to be delivered. And the pressure of oxygen inside that cell is higher than the pressure of oxygen in the mitochondria. And I say that just to say that it is required, because oxygen is a passive diffuser throughout our body. So it's a passive diffuser that literally only flows because of gradient. And so we need to have this established gradient, a concentration gradient that allows oxygen to flow from high concentration to lower concentration at every step of its movement throughout, from the atmosphere all the way down to the mitochondria. Any barriers of diffusion, any increased inflammation, any cell membrane toxicity or rigidity, or damage to capillary systems, those become barriers to diffusion, which, even though you might be 100% saturated with oxygen with a pulse ox, you could have areas of hypoxia, either systemic hypoxia or local hypoxia, due to barriers in that diffusion process. We all know that as we go up in elevation, it's a little bit more difficult to breathe. A lot of people say there's less oxygen, but just to be very clear, it's not less from a percentage standpoint. So, sea level is 21% oxygen. The top of Mount Everest is 21% oxygen. Essentially, the difference between those two locations is not percentage, it's pressure. And so the pressure at elevation is less, and as a result, molecules of oxygen are more spread out than they are at sea level. So I could still take a full volume of air in my lungs. I'm making up numbers, but let's just say, 100 units of air at sea level and 100 units of air at the top of Mount Everest. There would be a smaller number of molecules of oxygen at elevation due to the fact that those molecules are more spread out. As you lose that pressure gradient, you're literally also losing the oxygen gradient, which is that driving force for diffusion. And so the opposite is true, essentially, as we go below sea level. So as we go below sea level, pressure increases beyond sea level pressures. And as a result, it increases that gradient dramatically. And so just to give you an idea how dramatic the difference between going up and going down in terms of depth and elevation, if I was at sea level, which is considered one atmosphere, if I wanted to cut that in half in terms of going up in elevation, you would have to go 18,000 feet above sea level to find half of an atmosphere. And contrast that to below sea level. If instead of going from 1 ATA to half, I wanted to go from, cutting it in half, I wanted to go from 1 atmosphere and double it, I only need to go 33 feet below sea level. And so it's what all I really want to share with that is just to say, you can get incredibly high levels, or incredibly higher levels of pressure as we descend below sea level using a chamber than as far as distance wise compared to going up in elevation. It does not take an incredibly deep exposure to pressure to have massive changes in oxygen delivery and oxygen absorption. Inside the hyperbaric chamber, essentially all we're doing is we're creating a temporary increased atmospheric environment. I would say, just to give you some ranges, the more mild hyperbaric environment is about 30% more pressure than what we're getting right now. And those are often found in soft chambers. We call them 1.3. So a 1.3 ATA chamber is going to essentially deliver about 30% more pressure. And a standard clinical hard chamber would go all the way up to 3 atmospheres, or literally 3 times the amount of pressure than what you and I are getting right now. So that's the range of pressure. And then in terms of the other real big variable is the percentage of oxygen. So right now we're breathing air, and you can go into a chamber on air, and there would be quite a bit of benefit just from that alone. And then you can go all the way from, let's say, 1.3 ATA on air to all the way to 3.0 on 100% oxygen. That's like the full continuum of, pressure ranges and percentages of oxygen. The entire process doesn't work without pressure. In other words, 100% oxygen at the surface, because of the limited atmospheric pressure, we cannot absorb much more oxygen than what you and I are getting right now. But once you increase the once you increase the pressure, the atmospheric pressure, as you increase the percentage of oxygen, it has almost an exponential effect on the total oxygen delivered. And so, when I teach hyperbaric, I'm often saying we use that one word to describe that full range of tools. And the thing that gets us in trouble in the industry is that, you see a study, it says hyperbaric did this. Oh, well, I have a hyperbaric chamber, so I guess I can do that. However, because of this enormous range of pressure and percentages of oxygen, not every pressure or every percentage of oxygen is capable of doing exactly, a different pressure or percentage is able to do. And so, one of the things I try to teach is that we need to be more concise and specific and clear when we're discussing, the science of hyperbaric. Like, here's a study. This is what they did. They did, 100% oxygen at 2 atmospheres, 5 days a week for 90 minutes for 3 months. Like, that's a specific protocol. And, if you're doing 1.5 atmospheres, even if you did it for 2 hours or 3 hours instead of 90 minutes, and you did it twice a day instead of once a day, and did it for 6 months instead of 3 months, you can't just say that, this led to a certain outcome. I'm doing something different, but I'm going to claim to have the exact same outcome. Like, that is what gets us in trouble in the industry. And so I think understanding the laws and understanding the protocols and the parameters, and then speaking crystal clear about what you did or what you were going to do, as far as like helping people really understand what the potential benefits or the potential improvement somebody might see as a result of a certain program or protocol you're putting somebody through.
That makes a ton of sense, Jason. So it's important when you're reading the papers, because a lot of them do show really powerful outcomes, that there was a very specific protocol that was followed there, and it
Right.
just doesn't necessarily translate over if you're not following that protocol precisely.
Right. And it doesn't mean you can't, and it doesn't mean it's not reasonable to think that you might have similar outcomes.
Sure.
But it's really, when I see the claims being made, like, oh yeah, I mean, the biggest argument, if you're in hyperbaric at all, this, the biggest argument is people who do a lot of soft chamber might say things like, well, this thing basically does anything high pressure is capable of doing. And it may or may not. We just don't have enough evidence to actually say that out loud. On the
Understood.
flip side, you have somebody using hard chambers, high pressure, and they'll say something like, well, soft chambers just don't do anything. They're virtually useless. There's no therapeutic value whatsoever. Neither side of that conversation is accurate. It's just, where do these benefits begin and end? What pressures are required to create the changes that we're looking for? And then, like I said, how do we create these meaningful protocols? So, I think that's really an area that, if you're going to get into hyperbarics, or you're already into hyperbaric, but as you learn more and you start conversing about it, just making sure that we're speaking in terms of, only claiming the things that we know to be true, and being careful as we skirt the edges of anything less than that.
Copy that. So,
Do you want to hit a
couple,
question or two before we go?
yeah, there's a couple that are starting to bubble up here. I've seen a few ask about stacking other modalities, and a couple people have specifically referenced methylene blue and red light and other things, weight training. Uh, I know that's also a very open-ended question, but can you speak to maybe one or two preferred stacks? You know, methylene blue specifically has been mentioned by a few people here. So comments on stacking that one, or I know you've mentioned to me that like red light or sauna can often be nice complement to HBOT. So maybe just one or two thoughts on other things you could stack in
Yeah,
and
I
when you
mean,
might do so.
yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is something like, um, there's been such a strong movement with regard to all of these different therapies. I love all of them, and then at the same time, it's like, how do we do as many as possible in as short a period as
Hmm.
possible as time? And,
Yep.
how do I basically do everything at the same time in 30 minutes, 7 days a week and
Just put the IV drip in the
in
tank,
the
put the red light, the
chamber,
sauna,
with
the
the red light
PEMF just right
and
in
make the
there, and
sauna
then
hot.
in
Right.
60 minutes, I've checked off 5 of the boxes.
Right.
It's not
And
a bad
so,
idea.
there's a time and a place for that. I won't say that I'm also guilty of pieces of that myself. And at the same time, some of these devices are very powerful. A lot of them are very powerful and sort of deserve their own space, I think, physiologically.
Yep.
And then I also would say that, what I try to do in my own clinic or even when I'm working with other clinics, like, how do you press and pulse these things? Like, here's 10 things you could do. You don't have to do every single one of them every single morning, right? Like, maybe we hyper focus on 2 or 3 of them for a month or two. And then we
Yep.
go into like a maintenance mode and then we hyper focus on 2 or 3 different ones. Like, it has to be more about what's the outcome I'm trying to create. And then how do I
Completely.
utilize these tools to get to that outcome? And then how do I pulse them in a way that, like, I could also, I want to, like, say hi to my kids. I want to try to be a good husband. I also have to go to work today. Like, how do I be who I want to be or need to be and, take care of myself simultaneously without going a little too far in any direction. And I think, some really dedicated time to trying to understand these tools and how they work, how they interact with each other, and which ones ought to be combined and which ones maybe just need a little bit of space. There's value in that conversation, which is a much bigger conversation than what we could have right now.
Totally.
Essentially, what I would do is I would break it into concepts. I'd say, like, hey, if I wanted to reduce inflammation, what could be a stack for reducing inflammation? Well, we know hyperbaric reduces inflammation. Terrific. Um, we could also say, on some level, especially if we wanted to look at it from like an oxidative stress standpoint, like, hydrogen can also help reduce oxidative stress, which could lead to an inflammatory response. And as another example, methylene blue is also a great redox molecule that could really help, shift some of our oxidative stressors. So, methylene blue in the morning, hydrogen about 30 minutes before you're hyperbaric, give it a jump start and, get into the chamber. There's also some, not conflict, but like there's some back and forth between, let's say, methylene blue specifically and hydrogen. And so in some cases, we want to combine them relatively close. In other cases, you might want to separate them. Um, you know, John Lawrence, and Brian Richards and we were playing with like the red, blue, and O2 protocol. So we were saying, okay, here's some from a now from like more of like a mitochondrial stack, methylene blue in the morning for its mitochondrial benefits, and then red light about 20, 30 minutes before your hyperbaric session, get some vasodilation, get a little nitric oxide, stimulate cytochrome C. The methylene blue being that redox molecule, also helping to, stimulate the mitochondrial complexes, and then hyperbaric driving in, essentially, a good amount of oxygen after the fact. So, um, there's a lot of ways to
There's
do
a lot there, and it's just going
like
to
that.
depend on the outcome and the goal,
Right. So
I think.
rather
And then
than
how
just
do you even
say
measure
which,
said outcome?
right, like which tools are cool and which ones can you do together, but rather that, I'd say, what's the outcome I'm trying to accomplish? and which tools are most likely going to lead to that outcome. And then how can I arrange those in a way that I can stack them, effectively? I would love more conversations like that.
Copy that. Thank you, Jason.
Of course.
Yeah, next slide. I'll pluck a few more questions here while you're rolling.
Sure. So, I guess I'll bring this up here, and this is one of those questions, but it's a very unique delivery system. In other words, the thing about hyperbaric is that it is creating this temporary increase in atmospheric pressure. We know that oxygen specifically follows its pressure gradient. And as we increase the atmospheric pressure and we increase the percentage of oxygen we're breathing, the amount of increased oxygen delivery is literally exponential, from anywhere between maybe 28 or 29% more oxygen than what you and I are getting right now, all the way up to like 20 or 24 times the amount of oxygen that what you and I are getting right now. So the opportunity for enormous amounts of oxygen delivery is really incredible and unique in terms of the delivery. Questions I get all the time, and I can't answer all of the details in this minute, but like, what about EWOT? What about ozone? These are oxygen therapies. Why can't I just do that? And the answer is, well, you can. They're great tools. I use EWOT. I use ozone. But I would say, again, it depends on what outcome you're trying to accomplish. I'm very much into speaking the truth as much as humanly possible. And so, I love EWOT as a training tool. You can increase supply and demand. You can create pressure gradient differentials by increasing oxygen utilization, which creates a higher demand to pull that oxygen in. At the same time, it's not changing atmospheric pressure. So if we're talking like what amount of increased oxygen are we actually able to do? And could we compare those numbers? I would say if oxygen delivery was the most important component, hyperbaric can deliver exponentially more oxygen than what EWOT is able to deliver. I think the other big difference is that EWOT is a very active device. Hyperbaric is a very passive device. Hyperbaric, you're just laying there absorbing oxygen no matter what. And EWOT requires increasing and decreasing intensities of exercise in order to get the effect that we're looking for. And as a result, two things. One, some people might not be well enough to do the intensity that they need to get the benefit of EWOT. That's one. And two, most of the oxygen, if you're working intensely at a given moment, the majority of oxygen we bring in is going to go to working muscle tissue, not necessarily, let's say, to your brain. Whereas if you're passive and you have this enormous load of oxygen, there's less demand to pull that oxygen in any one direction, and may allow the body to utilize that oxygen in a way that the body deemed more appropriate. If you're trying to use it from a performance tool, a red blood cell training tool, and an adaptation for training, I think EWOT would be far more important than hyperbaric. Both systems could be helpful, but they ought to be used differently. Ozone, again, similarly, you're using the free radical side of oxygen more than anything else. Hyperbaric has a regenerative capacity to it. Hyperbaric has an infection fighting capacity to it. Ozone has an infection capacity to it and some regenerative capacity. But if fighting the infection was the most important tool or the most important outcome, I would probably lean to ozone for a while before using hyperbaric. If tissue repair and regeneration or mitochondrial function was the main goal, then I would definitely lean into hyperbaric over ozone. And so, I'm not just like hyperbaric's the only great oxygen tool out there. I love oxygen and other gas. I mean, hydrogen and carbon dioxide, these are all gases we could use therapeutically. All I'm saying again is we have to go back to the outcome we're trying to accomplish and which tool would deliver that outcome the best. And each one of those are very unique and would offer whoever's using that a very specific set of benefits. And so we shouldn't market like, EWOT is a cheap and fast hyperbaric, because it's not. EWOT is EWOT and hyperbaric is hyperbaric. And depending on your outcome, you ought to use the right tool that's going to get you the effect that you're looking for. One thing about hyperbaric is that, I say this all the time and it surprises people that it comes out of my mouth, but hyperbaric doesn't cure anything. And I don't think we should have ever gotten into the business of hyperbaric treating or curing anything. Hyperbaric is just an oxygen delivery system, period. Right? Hyperbaric oxygenation. And it just so happens that except for the red blood cells that carry oxygen, every other cell in our body needs oxygen for performing whatever job that cell type is supposed to do. And so as we increase the levels of oxygen, we can increase levels of cellular performance. I mean, essentially, it's more complicated than that, but essentially it's almost as simple as that. And so, hyperbaric gets put into this category of like, it cures everything. And I think that is, again, one of the things that gives it its bad, for people who don't like hyperbaric, like, well, how can one tool really cure so many different things? I would say one tool can't cure anything. One tool can only provide the body with one of the ingredients that our bodies require for healthy, normal function. We're limited to the amount of oxygen we can carry at any given time. But hyperbaric, through this unique delivery system, allows us to absorb far more oxygen than what's typically possible. And as a result, that surplus of oxygen could be utilized for the body to heal in so many different ways. And so while it doesn't cure anything, it does happen to become very helpful for so many conditions or performance-related issues or, inflammatory and mitochondrial diseases, et cetera. And so, I want to kind of be clear on my stance as far as like treatment and curing. And then lastly, the biggest change that I went through from a hyperbaric provider, I suppose, was the day that I realized that my chamber is not a modality inside my clinic. Like we have ultrasound, we have electric stim, we have hot packs and cold pack. Like we have modalities. And when I treated it like a modality, that was sort of the relationship we had. When I treated it like a business, that was the relationship we had. And from a how many people can I help standpoint, and from a revenue generation inside my clinic standpoint, when the day I made that shift in my mindset is the day that the business changed dramatically. You want to hit me with some questions?
Well said, Jason. Yeah, thank you. That was very well said. John, you have any comments, questions here before I pick a few from the chat?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of great information in there. I think probably the biggest takeaway is kind of the summarization of what you said, that it's not a modality in of itself, but it's allowing your body to heal, to treat different types of, diseases. Can you maybe, I know we're not really talking about the science, but can you talk briefly about the HBOT impact on mitochondria and why those other modalities may kind of synergistically help improve function?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say this too. I mean, I'm not, I don't get anything for the YouTube channel anyway, but just to tell people that exists, like I've done videos comparing HBOT and EWOT, videos comparing ozone and hyperbaric. I've done videos on all of these different tools and exactly where in the electron transport chain they are actually most active. And so therefore, why these devices are so important for mitochondrial function, to your point. But essentially, when I teach that side of it, I teach it almost like it's a factory. I think here are the raw materials you stick in. Here are all the, the workers on the, assembly line, so to speak, and ATP, cellular energy, is the output. And the idea is, how do we move these electrons from higher concentration to lower concentration? Again, it's a concentration gradient. And as a result of that movement, where are all the rate limiting steps to energy production? And then where do these modalities fit from a removal of that rate limiting step to make sure that we're optimizing each step of energy production? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, if you looked at like methylene blue, is an energy, it's like an energy donator. It can interact with complex 1, 2, and 3. It's a very rare molecule. Most cannot actually interact with all three of the first three complexes inside the mitochondria. But essentially, that's one delivery system of, if you remember, like NAD and FADH2, which is what starts the electron transport chain. We know that like fasting is a great way to increase NAD, like being in ketosis, to your point, even like exogenous ketones. What a great way, small molecule, very energy dense, provides an enormous amount of raw material right at the beginning of that factory phase, right? So the more raw material you can dump in, the higher the concentration gradient, the more likely we're going to produce more ATP. The next rate limiting step essentially would be ubiquinol or CoQ10. So CoQ10 is another great, mitochondrial tool to be used, and it's an easy test to see if someone's deficient. So that's something that should be assessed. The next rate limiting step is a molecule called cytochrome C. And so the stimulation of cytochrome C allows, movement of electrons from one side of the assembly line to the other side of the assembly line. And we know that certain frequencies of red light are incredibly high and potent cytochrome C stimulators. The next most important, or really the main rate limiting step in energy production, is actually oxygen. Oxygen moves in to bind with a few hydrogen, essentially just to make water at that point. But that's what dislodges and allows the next cycle to come through. And so without oxygen, again, that energy production gets stuck. And then that whole thing is really just to improve how much hydrogen we have, or the gradient of hydrogen, which is what, if you remember, what spins ATPase, which is the molecule, the machinery. It's the enzyme, but it's a machinery that actually phosphorylates ADP. So ADP to plus adding one more ADP so that you can basically make ATP. That last step is done through a hydrogen gradient. And so, that's where hydrogen could play a role in some of this, red light, et cetera. But I have like a 20 minute, pretty concise, but with illustrations sort of describing the electron transport chain and where a lot of these tools actually fit. If somebody wants to look that up, I think it would help answer that
Well, we
question.
can include that, Jason. We're going to send out the replay. We'll include, if you want to send us your top 2 or 3 videos on that, we'll include them in the email along with the replay.
Yeah, I love it.
A lot of questions coming in, which are kind of like a tee up for the next slide here,
Okay.
Jason. Just questions about the business model, how much to charge for a session. That one's come up a few times. How do you bundle sessions? Is it a la carte? Do you sell them in bundles? So I think it's just a good segue into starting to think about how this works from the business side operationally.
So, I'll cover some of that and we'll see if other questions pop from it. But essentially, there is insurance billing for hyperbaric, and there's cash practices with hyperbaric. Essentially, if you're utilizing hyperbaric off label, which I'm assuming the majority of people listening to this would be, essentially that's all going to be cash based. There are now, there have been 14 approved indications. As of a few months ago, there's a 15th approved indication, which was avascular necrosis of the femoral head, which is essentially just another version of like an arterial insufficiency, which was already covered, but it's a specific type of that. Even though, and if you're in medicine at all, which probably many of you are, this, like just because it's an approved indication and you can bill does not mean that the insurance companies are going to reimburse you. So there's a huge disconnect between, what was approved and what is actually reimbursed. And then there's another huge disconnect between, what this device might be able to do and who has deemed which conditions to actually be approved indications. But essentially, I would say post-radiation necrosis, that one's typically covered relatively well. Some of these arterial insufficiencies, particularly as they would be included in a lot of the wound care, those could be generally relatively well covered. But essentially, a lot of them, a lot of the approved indication list is really still not easily insurance reimbursable. And unless you're in an unless you're like in a hospital setting, you may not even be sort of prepared to handle the overwhelming majority of on-label cases. My malpractice specifically says that I cannot do wound care. And I had the choice essentially to do that or not. My insurance was premiums were different by saying I don't. But quite honestly, like in my clinics, I'm not really staffed. I'm not going to be doing wound debridement and other things in the wound care model. And so I chose just not to participate in that whole process. For a clinic that's actually trying to move into a cash model, hyperbaric is a tool that could be utilized to help transition, that tool being a cash, service in your clinic. And then as people get more used to paying cash in your clinic, it gets easier and easier to charge for different services cash versus, they just assume they're kind of coming and going and either paying you a small, copay or co-insurance or, not paying you anything. When patients are trained in that way, it's hard to break that model. And sometimes we need a really powerful, strong tool that is a cash-based tool to really start breaking that sort of mindset of our patients coming into our office. And a lot of people have used Hyperbaric to start that transition of, away from insurance and towards cash pay. I brought up a la carte memberships, these therapeutic programs or directed wellness care, and one of the reasons I brought these up is not to suggest that they're good ideas, but just that the fact that they're out there and so that you understand, like you could just offer it. People could buy 1 or 2 hyperbaric sessions. But again, if you're really looking at the business of hyperbaric, virtually almost nobody will do 1 or 2 sessions and that's the end of their story. And so sometimes offering it or even just like, marketing the fact that you have that as an option puts in the mind of the people like, "Ooh, I always wanted to try that. Let me try that once." And my opinion, like we don't typically do that. You can't, you could certainly come in, you could do a consultation, you could do 1 or 2 sessions, but there's an entire, consultation process, thought process, and very specific instructions we give patients if they're going to do 1 or 2 sessions, that's not because we expect to see changes in those 1 or 2 sessions. It's because I just want them to experience it, understand what they're getting into, and in their mind, picturing, is this something I can do for the, 3 or 4 times a week for the next month or 2? Because if it is, then we'll transition them into a package. And essentially, if it's not, I don't want them to buy a $3,000 or $4,000 package, do 1 session, and now I have to refund them because they can't, whatever, they had a bad experience or they don't want to move forward. So we have a system in place like that, but we will not let people essentially pay 1 at a time. Even if they wanted to pay 1 at a time for 30 or 40 sessions, it's not really something that we offer as an option. My main reason for that is essentially that if they know they needed 40 and they're paying me 1 at a time and they're choosing not to bundle them into a package and get a significant discount for doing it, in my opinion, what they're saying is, I'm not really committing to your recommendations. I'm going to do as many as I want to do until I decide whether I think it's working or not. And then I'm going to leave or stay based on that decision-making matrix. And I think that that's a big mistake for us to allow the patient to make that decision when it might not have been in their best interest. Similarly with the membership model. And again, I know people do it extensively. And some people do it and they love it and it's a successful model. So if you are, please don't think I'm telling you have to do something different. But I do believe that hyperbaric fits into a category where the overwhelming majority of people will never do the total amount and or the frequency necessary to get whatever goal they were hoping to achieve if they're not told specifically what that's going to look like. They might do it twice a week. They might do it once a week for 6 weeks, twice a week for 2 months. The likelihood that they're literally going to actually on their own decide that they know how many they need and stick to that throughout the whole journey that they might be required to get even if it's not a disease process, it's just for, let's say, longevity or, improved mitochondrial function. I think most people on their own would likely drop out of care prematurely. And I think from a business standpoint, besides the fact that anyone that drops out of care that doesn't get the results they want is, an unfortunate situation. More importantly, that becomes somebody walking around your community saying, I tried hyperbaric and it didn't work. And that's, when I hear that, my first question is, tell me more about what it looked like when you tried it. Not that it is going to help everybody, but more often than not, I'll hear something like, well, I did 3 or 4 sessions and my autoimmunity that I've had for 20 years was not completely cured. And I'm like, okay, well, if you thought that was going to be, then somebody misled you in the first place, So I think therapeutic programs and directed wellness. And what I mean by that is these people have a conversation with somebody who's spending time to understand what this patient's goals are, what they're trying to achieve, is hyperbaric a good fit? Like, does hyperbaric actually get you the benefits that you're hoping for? And then what is the protocol that they would need to follow in order to get those benefits? I think that that's a critical component of the business model. And it's important to hold people to it, the accountability of that in order to make sure that they're actually getting the results that they wanted.
Thanks, Jason. I know when we spoke on the podcast, you made a comment and you said that it was something like 80% of the practices you work with who get one chamber end up eventually, well, not eventually, but in relatively short order, getting 3. So maybe if you could just comment on how that works. And then I realize this is going to vary from business to business, but there's some questions coming in about cost of package. What would a 40 session package break down to per session? So if you could throw some ballpark numbers out there, and then just maybe comment on like those who start with 1 quickly end up with more than 1.
Can you go to the next slide? Because I think that's what we talk about.
Oh, okay. Hang on. Oh, this question's coming up a lot as well. So let's just tackle this one here, and then we'll get into the money part.
Which one? Like the
hard shell, soft shell.
Oh, okay. So, and
this
unfortunately,
could probably be a whole webinar, admittedly.
I mean, literally,
like,
it is. Yeah, it's even more than a webinar. But one thing during the short science conversation that we had, there were a bunch of links that I don't know if they were thrown into the chat or not, but essentially,
I think Ryan has them. Ryan, if you have the study links, if you can drop them in there.
If you could just drop them in. I mean, essentially, there's just that, I don't know if I took 5 or 6 studies, not as an attempt to try to answer every question on planet Earth, but just some, I think, more of the sort of important research that's been done recently. I believe 2 of them are specifically longevity related with regard to, I'm sure a lot of you have seen essentially the hyperbaric and telomere study that was done a few years ago. I also wanted to include what was called the hypoxia paradox, which is, this concept of, being exposed to higher and lower oxygen levels, essentially creating like a wave of increased and decreased oxygen. And
we did get some questions on that as well.
Yeah. And, I think understanding that in a way to say, like, I used to tell people when I started teaching a handful of years ago, I used to think that maybe like 50% of the session was the time you spent in the chamber, and 50% of the benefits are times you spent after, outside the chamber.
Yep.
Like, off gassing this oxygen. And I think what I would tell you today is I think that 85% of the benefit is actually getting out of the chamber. In other words, we have to go in the chamber in order to load. We call it like a loading phase and an unloading phase. So you need a loading phase, otherwise there's nothing to offload, right? And so, but essentially, going into the chamber and staying there longer versus going in, loading up, getting out, having this unloading, and then repeating that process. I believe that it's the off gassing or this relative hypoxia that comes about after a session. That is where the majority of, especially the benefits that most of us are looking for with either ourselves or our patients or our family, with regard to stem cells and the telomeres or DNA repair or any of the cellular or tissue repair and regeneration cycles, the growth factors that are released. So much of this is really coming from this this relative hypoxia that I think that's really where the future of a lot of this research is going. I also shared one study on high pressure stem cells, because that's been quoted for decades now with regard to, 2 atmospheres of pressure, essentially, stimulating or helping to mobilize about an 8-fold increase in stem cells. And that's both mesenchymal stem cells and central nervous system stem cells. But I then also included a 1.3 study on stem cells, because again, does this low pressure actually do anything or not? And so in that study, which was done in 2023 out of the University of Wisconsin, Kent McLaughlin found essentially, and this was a soft chamber, you actually used a soft chamber, and there was no additional oxygen. So this was an air only soft chamber. And they found between a 2.5 and 3 times increase in stem cells. So at the lowest end possible, they saw a 2.5 to
Yep.
3 times.
Still nice increase.
And at 2 atmospheres, which isn't the highest we can go, but it's a good amount of exposure, that was about 8 times increase. And so now we're just starting to at least understand like sort of the goalposts of like what we can expect from a stem cell standpoint, you know, between the lowest possible and sort of a pretty moderate or high end of 2.0. So I just wanted to include those to add to your sort of understanding of hyperbaric. What I can't add is all of the research that I'll be presenting over the next like probably 3 to 6 months, which is the research that's come out of you know, the PhD pro. So I'm finishing a PhD program, presenting my data in about 3 weeks. And I'll be starting to pull out papers, you know, from that data and publishing those. But essentially, the question I asked was this question: 1.3 versus 2.0, and then we measured 81 different cytokines, and we measured cognitive performance, and we measured, you know, standard blood work, and we measured a whole, you know, Dave, we used True Diagnostics, you know, for the
Awesome.
all the
The aging
epigenetic
clocks
information.
and
Yeah.
the telomeres
So
and
the
all
aging
that kind of
clocks,
stuff.
but on the
Nice.
research side, they give you all kinds of other really
Oh,
incredible
yeah.
detail on the
Sweet.
epigenetic side of things. And so, you know, now we have a much better idea. Like 1.3 had certain effects, 2.0 had certain effects. In some areas, there was a lot of overlap. In some areas, there was essentially no overlap whatsoever. In other words, low pressure did something that high pressure did not, and high pressure did something that low pressure did not. And so I think what is going to come from
Got it.
this is a better understanding of like, hey, we need different amounts of pressure at different times for stimulating different pathways. And so as we learn more about that, we could become much more specific about, well, this pressure in order to get this effect and this pressure in order to get that effect. And so I'm very excited to be sharing that with you guys over the next handful of months. But, you know, stay tuned. I actually just recorded in that 6 months of YouTube videos that I just finished doing. I recorded a whole series on my research. I can't release it until like the end of March. And so, but those will come up on that YouTube channel. And if you go to any of like, you know, if you were at A4M, I spoke a little bit about it there. I'll be at the next few biohacking conferences that are coming up, Miami, Austin, etc. Like I'll be speaking about it because I could tell, you know, pieces of it, and over time I'll be able to tell more. But essentially, they're all powerful. They all have a biological effect. And it's not like one is good and one is bad. It's what kind of practice are you running? What kind of people are you seeing? What kind of effects are you trying to have? What are your goals in your clinic and with your people? And those are, you know, when somebody asks me what kind of chamber I should get, I don't say, oh, you should get a whatever. I say, I need to know more about what you plan on doing, right? Because you could do it any way, but it's really, those are the kinds of questions when I consult with somebody, those are the kinds of questions I ask to better understand what you're trying to accomplish, because the right equipment for you will come from those questions, not because it's my opinion of what chamber is better. It's really how you plan to use it and who you plan to use it with. I did want to share some numbers because I know people are asking about that. So essentially, you know, I'll use round numbers just to like throw some numbers your way, but essentially a good soft chamber with anything else you might need with it to make it, you know, operate properly and safely inside your office, you could be at like somewhere between, let's just say roughly 25 grand, right? A hard chamber, again, I see people asking questions about like ASME and PVHO, and those are really important questions to ask. And there's a lot of liability and legality built into those questions, which, you know, hopefully we can at least cover some of, but again, those are entire lectures unto themselves. But, you know, you're not getting a PVHO, ASME, and or FDA approved chamber, hard chamber for less than 100 grand. Like they're going to be 120, 150, 175. Like this is not an inexpensive piece of equipment if you're going for the hard chamber. If you find a $30,000 to $60,000 hard chamber, I can guarantee you it is not ASME and PVHO approved. And if you can find one that is, and you can prove me wrong, please do. I'd be happy to be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, is what I've seen in the industry, that's what I've seen. But
So 25K on the soft side.
yeah,
And then
let's
what did
just
you
say
say on
150. Let's just say whatever, you know, just,
150?
you know, plus the oxygen sources and, you know, other things like this.
And then let's say
But
you got 3
essentially,
of those
I want
going full barrel. What are
wait
we
real
looking
quick.
at?
I want to
Yep.
say something real quick and say, like, if you're looking at soft chambers and you're like, well, this one's 30 grand and this one's 15, and that's like the thing that's going to make or break your business model, you don't have a good business model. Like, if $15,000 difference on the equipment itself, based on what these things are possibly going to do for you inside your clinic, I believe you're asking the wrong questions. And that's what I kind of wanted to share number wise. So, essentially on one chamber, let's say you spent 25 grand on a on the soft chamber, and let's just say roughly you're open 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Okay. My clinic is open 7 days a week, and we're open almost 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, and like 8 or 9 hours a day on Saturdays and Sundays. So our availability is pretty large. But if you were doing like a 9 to 5 gig and you were doing 60-minute sessions, you'd be packed at like 6 sessions a day. So let's just say you could do between 4, let's be a little bit more conservative. You did 4 sessions to 6 sessions a day in one chamber. And the national average per session is about $100 in a soft chamber. So essentially, if you were doing, 4 to 6 sessions a day, 5 days a week, you're somewhere between like 80 to 120 sessions a month, I think. Does that make sense? Are you with me?
Yep. Let's say
So,
5 a day conservatively. That's right in the
okay.
middle. Times
You know,
5
so,
days is 25 a week. And so
and
that's 100 in a month.
100, right? And then if you're charging about 100 per session, you should be able to do, what is that? 10 grand a month.
Yep. On
Right.
one.
So on one chamber, you should be looking conservatively. I would tell anybody between 100 and 150,000 a year per soft chamber
Yep.
just from a revenue standpoint. That's very reasonable.
Copy.
The next thing I would say is that the average number of session any new patient would do coming into your office really should be about 20 hours. Some people will do 5, some people will do 10. A lot of people should do 20, but a lot of people should do 30, 40, 50 or more. So we call it PVA, patient visit average. Your patient visit average in the chamber should be around 20. So essentially, just to give you some numbers, if you had, each case was doing 20 sessions at $100 a pop inside that package, you're looking at every new patient should drive around $2,000 of revenue. Right. And so essentially, 15 patients at 2 grand a piece should be bringing in 30 grand. So like, if you can't find 15 patients to help pay for the initial investment of that single chamber, again, you're in the wrong business, or you're thinking about it in some other way that is not going to get you financially the results that you're looking for. And so to break it down that way is just to try to help you sort of understand at least some of the details there. Now, real quick.
And you can model it out. Like, you can start with those numbers and scratch it out, and
Right.
pencil it out and see what it's going to do in terms
Now,
of your,
most of the fixed costs
performer.
is whether it's like your area, your space that you're either renting or renting to yourself, maybe for the hyperbaric, your cost of your technician who's running it. Other than the equipment itself, the majority of the other costs are really fixed. So as you add a second chamber, essentially one person, that same technician, can operate 2 chambers. One person could easily operate 3 chambers. Right. And so essentially right away, you're going from, 100 to 150 a year per soft chamber. Now you have 2. So now you're like 2 to 3 or 4, even, 400 per 3 chambers. Like it's not that difficult to scale that once you understand. It doesn't take many people to fill the chamber. If people are essentially committing to 20 hours over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, like, those spots get filled very quickly, and the need for an additional chamber will build very quickly.
That's super helpful information. Thanks,
On
JJ.
the hard chamber side, just to flip it a little bit, like let's say it's 150 grand, but you're not going to charge, even though it's 5 times the cost, you're not going to charge 5 times the session. So there's a little bit of an inverse relationship there. It's a lot more expensive, but maybe you could charge 2 to 3 times the most. But let's just say you charge twice. So now you're averaging 200 instead of 100 per session. same numbers, right? The 4 to 6 sessions a month would be the same. The 120 sessions of 4 to 6 a week. The 120 sessions a month will essentially be the same. So you're looking at roughly, maybe what would you be at? You'd be at like 16,000, I think, a month, roughly. But any hard chamber should bring you at least 200 grand, like between 2 to 250 per hard chamber in your clinic of revenue would be pretty like a good goal to be shooting for, essentially. And so even if you're spending 150 for it in your first year, like, once you're running these, the amount of maintenance and consumables or, repairable devices, it's very minimal. And so like really once you have that main investment into the equipment, there's really not a lot that needs to be on an ongoing basis, that essentially, the revenue just starts to stack once your equipment is paid off.
Awesome.
So I hope that helps at least answer like some of those initial questions. And essentially, I think once you're really running 4 chambers, you should be running probably two technicians or having a pretty strong overlap between the technician shifts so that they could really start helping one another. It's not impossible at all, but there's just other business that goes on inside that room besides strictly turning chambers over. Or if one chamber needed somebody's attention for whatever particular reason, that backup becomes important, I think, at that point.
And then Jason, can you talk a little bit about the technicians and what type of training they would need? And roughly like, is that someone that's kind of like you train up who's already in there, or you have someone dedicated to that? That would also, I imagine, impact the.
I mean, right. As it
financial
grows, like the more it grows, the more you should have like I think your technician team. A lot of people in the beginning have some sort of like medical assistant or, CA or whatever their supportive staff are called. And they might do a few things. They do a little bit of this, a little bit of this. They jump into the chamber room, but as the chamber grows, you really want somebody inside that room or with that equipment primarily as their main role. Every clinic in America is required, and this is true outside the US, but not everywhere outside the US, but definitely inside the US. Everyone is required to have a safety director. And so that's one course and one certification. Not every person in the clinic needs to be a safety director, but every clinic needs to have at least one safety director. So that's a course that people could take in order to get that. We offer, you could do it anywhere you want, but we do offer a safety director course. It's online. I think that information's at the end, Dave.
Yep.
And then you'd want some sort of hyperbaric technician training. So there's a basic hyperbaric technician. There's a intermediate hyperbaric technician. Again, we do, that's, most of what I do these days is training and certifying doctors and training and certifying technicians in hyperbarics. And so, now they're getting trained to handle, the typical workload of a hyperbaric business, but also, of course, hyperbaric emergencies or other issues that might pop up. Nervous patients that have issues equalizing their ears. Anyone could theoretically be a great technician. If you don't have somebody that you love and you're looking, I love to hire like paramedics, EMTs, and retired emergency nurses, mostly because they know what actual emergencies are like. And a standard hyperbaric emergency compared to what they've seen and how they've operated life is not that much of an emergency. And so to me, that helps keep the hyperbaric room very calm.
Yep.
But the most important attribute, in my opinion, of a hyperbaric technician, other than being organized and responsible, is really being empathetic, because the people that they're going to see every day are typically pretty challenged in their health. And they're going to play on some role. They're going to play, not just delivering the tool from a therapeutic standpoint, but they're going to play like this interactive role with this person. And to have somebody who's compassionate and empathetic, I think, is not something you can teach, but something that a lot of the people who look for hyperbaric really need. And so I think that's an important piece to it.
Awesome. just given the time here, Jason, I think what I'm going to do is actually jump ahead and let's get the prize winners announced.
Okay.
And then what we'll do is we'll flip back to the Q&A. And for those who can stay on, we'll take as many questions as we can, and we'll go for another, whatever, 20 or 30 minutes. So Aaron, are you on? I'm going to bring you back on to the webinar, and you get the great honor of selecting our winners here. So I'm going to bring Aaron back in as a panelist. And we've got 4 prizes to give away. And then we're just going to go right back to a couple more slides. And there's lots of questions we want to answer here while we have Dr. Saunders. So we'll roll till 1/2 past. Does that work for you, Jason? John?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Copy that. All right, over to you, Aaron.
Awesome. So for our winners, we have Manoj Sharma. Are you here? Can you send a chat, Manoj? You won the True Diagnostics.
Okay, I've made a note.
We've got an Aura Ring winner, and that is Dr. Chris Lorang. Are you here, Dr. Chris?
Oh, Chris.
I think he gave you a plug, Jason.
Awesome. We've got Delta G winner, John Wenhold. And Craig Ellison won our Quicksilver supplements.
John's here. Manoj is here. I don't see Chris. What was the last one, Aaron?
We've got Dr. Chris Lorang and
Is Chris
Craig
Lorang still on?
Ellison.
And Craig Ellison. Chris or Craig? Craig
I
is
see
on.
Craig Ellison's on and Chris Lorang.
Chris may have dropped off.
Okay, let's see about one more
Who's still
here.
with us?
All right, we have Michael Perazzo.
Okay, Michael, you with us?
All
Check,
right.
check, Michael. Yep, we got Michael.
I've got everyone listed here, and we will follow up with our winners to collect addresses. Congratulations.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, everybody. So for those who want to stay on, Jason had 1 or 2 more slides. There's a few things we want to show in heads up about how you track the results, because that's a big part of retention engagement. And then we'll handle questions. So Jason, there were some questions coming in about like, who can be the safety director, for example? And do I need a medical director? So are these just people who have gone through a training course and obtained a credential? Or is there more to it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially part of the answer is it depends on what kind of equipment you run. In other words, like if someone's running an air only soft chamber as their main source of hyperbarics versus someone's running a 3.0 on 100% oxygen, like there's a lot of requirements that are going to be different from what equipment, how that room is built out, what goes into that room build, or what goes into the oxygen storage, etc. So part of that answer is built into like what type of hyperbarics are you wanting to run. But essentially, there's really no rule. Like essentially anyone could be the safety director, assuming that they're trained. There's not a whole lot that dictates exactly what that training is required, just that they are trained and certified. And so you ought to be a safety director, trained and certified, essentially in the type of equipment that you're operating. So, if you're running a multi-place chamber inside of a hospital and the only thing you really understand is the safety around a soft chamber, that's not going to be a good match, right?
Copy.
So there are different levels of all of these courses depending on what type of clinic you're running and what type of equipment you're running, essentially. But we can meet any of those demands. Usually those are the kinds of questions that we get individually to be like, okay, the right equipment comes from this series of questions. Once we know the right equipment, now I know which types of certifications and trainings you ought to get. It kind of, that all unfolds.
It all stacks as part of
literally like a 10 to 15 minute conversation,
Great.
which I'm happy to have, if people have these kinds of questions. this question about, first of all, I saw a bunch of questions about, I have lots of questions about hyperbaric and cancer, questions about this autoimmune condition. The other thing I haven't said out loud yet, obviously you could take any of our classes and we talk about that kind of stuff in depth in any one of our certification courses. At the same time, Dr. Dettori and I wrote a textbook that just came out in this past October. And essentially that textbook would cover, most of what we're talking about with regard to mechanisms of action, protocols, the science of hyperbaric, but all of these off-label protocols and what should you use as a guideline for what those protocols might look like. A lot of that is in the textbook if that's of interest.
What's the name of the book, Jason?
I didn't give you, the name of the book is The Art and Science of Hyperbaric Medicine.
Okay. So we'll include
It's
that in the
only
follow-up.
it's only offered through the publisher essentially, but I
Okay.
didn't give Ryan a link to that, but I can get Ryan a link to
We'll
the
include that. We're going to send out the follow-up replay. We'll include a link to the book, Jason's videos on mitochondria, and the studies, which Ryan pasted, but he couldn't paste the hyperlinks. So we'll get all of that bundled in with the follow-up.
And then there were a bunch of questions that I saw because it comes up here anyway about like ASME and PVHO approval, but essentially whether it's FDA approval in the US, FDA approval, ASME or PVHO, what you're saying is, what are the build to specs that this equipment is required to meet or exceed in order to make sure that the person going inside the chamber is safe? Are there chambers that are not FDA approved, PVHO approved, or ASME approved and are safe? The answer is, I'm sure that there are. But somebody asked the question, like, how can I tell somebody that they are if I don't have that approval? I don't know. Like, those are the approvals that guarantee that this thing meets or exceeds the safety standard.
Copy.
If you're treating yourself at home and you choose to buy a chamber that does not meet those requirements and you get hurt, I'll be sad, but essentially nobody cares. I don't mean that personally. I just mean like you could do whatever you want to yourself and nothing's gonna happen. If you're going into a clinical environment where you're sticking people in the chamber and you're, using it for a specific outcome and you're charging for it, and that chamber does not meet those standards and somebody gets hurt, your level of liability is going to far exceed your willingness to want to participate in it. God forbid that happen. And so, essentially from a clinical standpoint, that's the thing I get nervous about is, first of all, there's been a lot of drama in the field where, there have been some issues inside of clinics, either, using some soft chambers for a period of time, although most of that's blown over, or using equipment that isn't PVHO and ASME approved. And so that's a real important thing to just know whether you have it or not. And, I guess how to handle that should somebody ask you those questions. And then essentially moving in a direction where you know that your equipment has been tested in that way, because the liability, and let me just say this, and I'll end on at least this topic with that. It's one thing for the equipment to be deemed safe, and anybody can get hurt in any equipment. But if your equipment was deemed safe and approved for human use, and somebody gets hurt, that is possible, and there could be a lawsuit and whatever associated with that. I've never been asked to be a part of a lawsuit in my entire professional career, and in the last 6 months, I've been asked to be a part of 5 different lawsuits, most of them on the side of the clinic. And one of the things that I keep seeing are these lawsuits for these particular situations have been non-approved devices.
Got it.
And essentially, I wanted to jump in and be like, I want to stick up for the clinics because there's nothing I don't like more if you don't know me. Like if it's a frivolous lawsuit, like I will do anything to protect the practitioner. I'm really very anti that whole world. But if that's an issue right out of the gate that the equipment wasn't certified, I can't put my own opinion on the line and be like, well, no, that device is perfectly safe because technically it has to meet that requirement. So from a clinical standpoint, having those certifications are really, really important in my opinion.
Makes good sense. Thank you, Jason.
You know, I think slide wise, I feel like I've pretty much said my piece. So if we want to just drill me with a few more questions, or if you want to go through, because the last thing I actually wanted to end this whole thing on is keeping people, you know, keeping people engaged in their healthcare, because this is not a one-time or two-time thing. This is a 20, 30, 40. This is a 4 to 6 a week, you know, times a week for 8 to 10 weeks. Like, you and I are best friends by the time we're finished here. So how do you keep people engaged in their care for weeks and months at a time? One of those is how frequently you check in with them and see how they're doing, see what progress they're making, see how close they are to whatever original goals that they stated that they wanted to reach, you know, at that time. That's really important. And then the other way is by tracking their progress, because sometimes they feel more than the data will tell them is going on. And sometimes the data will tell them far more than what they feel. And we need both of those stories. And eventually they'll both catch up to one another and get the person to their goal. But it's incredibly important to show people, especially those where it's taking time for the symptomatically to improve, to show them that, like, we're measuring stuff and it's changing. And as a result of these changes, I know that the symptom that you're looking for is almost there, because we see all of these indications that things are healing and changing. And so to me, that's like, critical when it comes to getting people to stick around long enough to actually get the outcome that they were hoping for.
And on that note, Jason, we have built several modules into Heads Up specifically to help track the outcomes. To your point, if people can see the numbers getting better, that often just helps with conviction of what they're doing. Sometimes the numbers are getting better, but you might not objectively feel it. So there's use cases for having data. And the first thing you'll see is how do we even track how many sessions someone has done and how many hours they've been in the chamber? That's as simple as having a way to log sessions on their dashboard. And you can log the duration and the pressure of every session for each individual. There may also be other modalities that you're measuring or not. But then we can start to cross-reference it with other data points. We might look at something like heart rate variability. We might look at blood pressure. We might look at body comp or glucose or SpO2 levels. So the first thing is having an easy way to keep track of how much time someone has spent in the chamber. At the beginning, you said a lot of this is protocol specific. So can we definitively say that you did 5 sessions, 5 days a week for 2 hours at the right pressure and followed it prescriptively to the T? So the first thing you need is a way to log sessions. The second is a way to overlay it with other metrics. That's typically what we do through the dashboard. Here's an example where we looked at heart rate variability from the Oura Ring, and we compared that to the heart rate variability prior to the hyperbaric therapy. So here was the intervention period from March to October of last year. And we compared that to the baseline period. And we looked at how did heart rate variability change during that period. And in this individual, it went up substantially. That's not going to happen every time. The more important point is, can we look at what was the value? It doesn't have to be HRV. It could be anything. It could be HSCRP. It could be blood pressure. Pick your metric. And then can we start to look, how many sessions have we done? And what was the net improvement of said metric? That actually helps us quantify the outcome at an individual level. And then there's also tools to look across an entire practice. And what we want to be able to do is pull up every user on the chamber. And we want to say, okay, how many sessions have they done? How many hours have they spent in the chamber? How many times is the chamber being used? To Jason's point, each individual represents $2,000 potentially worth of revenue on 20 sessions. How many of those people are coming in on a monthly basis? So we can then roll up the stats that you need to help look at the entire usage across all chambers, across all users. So anytime someone comes in, you instantly know exactly how many sessions they've done, exactly how much time they've been in there, every single session they've logged. That helps you get really, really precise with tracking usage in the business. So those are just a few of the ways we can help you quantify this individually and then across the spectrum. This is more information from Jason. So if you want to consult with him, We'll include all of this information in the follow-up. These are a couple of our partners. So a couple chambers. This is a multi-place chamber for home use from our partner OxyHelp. There's also Jason's chambers. Those are two of the vendors that we recommend working with. We've already covered the prizes. If you want to get more information on any of this stuff in your practice, you can either scan this QR code, hit this link. We'd be happy to show you a demo of how all of this stuff works in practice. I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to stop the presentation here. And let's see, we've only got a couple minutes, but let me just pick a couple more out of here. Yes, we'll be sending out the recordings. The book is The Art and Science of Hyperbaric Medicine. I think we've covered a lot of this stuff, Jason.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get a copy. We'll get a
Anything you
link to
see
the
in here that
book.
you want to cover just quickly before we sign off? In the
We'll
chat?
we'll get you a link to the like to the courses and stuff if you guys are interested in that. Will you be doing safety 2 in UK? So we're going to offer safety director. So we have safety director level 1 online right now. We're going to be doing safety director level 2 live in Pensacola, Florida in the fall at the IHA conference.
Okay.
And then hopefully we're going to be recording that and then getting safety director 2 online sometime roughly like, I guess, December, January of next year, essentially.
Copy that.
I think that, I mean, there's a lot of questions, but we're doing the best we can. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We hope this information was helpful to you
Yes.
in your day-to-day. And we'll get the recording out with all the other information. If you've got questions and you want to just email us, you can hit us up at support@headsuphealth.com. If there's questions for Jason, we'll route them over.
Cool.
Jason, John, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That was
Jason.
Probably 5 more, 10 more webinars you could do on this very exciting topic, but we really just wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of putting this in a business. So thank you to you guys. Aaron, thank you for helping us in the chat, and also Ryan and Chuck. And thank you for joining, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.